Hi, fellow geochemists and geochemistry enthusiasts. Welcome to Geochemistry, the only podcast for people who love geochemistry with a side of tea. Our mission is to inspire and to shed light on the topics not fancy enough to talk about at a conference, but important to delve into. I'm your host, Sam Schur, and this week we are talking with McLean Trott about using supervised machine learning to classify geologic samples using geochemistry and corresponding photography. And guys, for the link to Mac's first publication and a big congratulations, head to our website at www.geochemistry.com. Mac is a senior geodata scientist embedded researcher at Goldspot Discoveries Corporation. Mac, welcome to Geochemistry.
Thanks, Sam. It's good to be here. Really honored to be invited and glad to see you doing this. It's really good content. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So even though Mac has never formally declared himself a geochemist, for as long as I've known him, he's loved it and integrated geochem as much as possible into each program that he's worked on. Now, going so far as to work at his PhD at Queen's University with a formidable economic geologist and geochemist. So Mac, can you talk to our young listeners about your dreams working on a farm in Manitoba and how you charted your career path towards ultimately working towards your current PhD research of data science and geochemistry?
Yeah, so sounds good. It's a long and convoluted story, but I'll try and make it interesting. So yeah, as you know, I grew up on a farm in the southwest corner of Manitoba, in a very rural area, mostly agriculture. There wasn't any mining in the area. Manitoba actually has a ton of mining, but it's in the north. The Flin Flon Belt is there for VMSs, and there's the Thompson Nickel Belt. There's some gold on the east side of the province. The Red Lake Cap is partially in Manitoba. But where I grew up, it was just farming and oil. But the interesting thing about where I grew up was that there's a lot of glacial erratics. And it was just kind of a thing that I did as a kid was monkey around in rock piles at the edges of fields and look for shiny stuff. And then in gravel pits and look for agates and fossils and things like that. So I had this giant rock collection built up by the time I was, I don't know, in my early teens, and kept going.
If I could interrupt you with this story and throw in something of my own, I grew up on Long Island in New York, which is a glacial moraine, and I used to collect quartz rocks.
Yeah, awesome.
And that was it, because that's all we had.
Well, there's some pretty cool quartz in New York State, eh? Like the is it Herkimer, New York? There's the famous Herkimer diamonds that are double terminated quartz, and I guess not in Long Island.
But. I mean, yeah, I'm just gonna say that outside of New York City, once you go further than that, it's all upstate and nothing matters to New Yorkers.
Yeah. Well, I love glacials because they're a sampling of everything. I didn't realize that at the time. I was just like, oh, there's just a whole bunch of different things going on in the same bucket of dirt. But they're a sampling of everything from the Arctic Circle down to where we were at the time. Those glaciers just scraped up a bit of everything, and some really cool stuff in there. So I was finding like tourmalines in granites as a kid, and like really neat fossils. Epidote was really exciting at the time. It's still exciting, but it's I had that childlike wonder for minerals, and kind of kept going with that. I still have a giant rock collection. Still go out on the weekends with my kids now.
Who doesn't have a giant rock collection?
Right, it's just what you do. Mm-hmm. So I got the bug there, and then it didn't really occur to me that there could be a career in that. until I graduated high school. I moved to Brandon. So this was the big city, Brandon. It's about 2 hours drive away. I think at the time maybe 60,000 people. This was the big smoke, the big time. Moved to Brandon, went to the university there, Brandon University, and still didn't really know what I was going to do. But I took a bunch of first year courses that were interesting to me, and one of them was first year geo, and I really liked the course. Ended up getting summer work with the Geological Survey, Manitoba Geological Survey, uh, that year. So went out to help out on a core logging project in the Nickel Belt for the summer. Really loved that. And then was just like, yeah, sure, let's do this. This is really interesting stuff. So stuck with it. Finished the degree in '05, and then went to industry. So that's kind of how I ended up as a geologist. And then, um, yeah, I went out. I worked in well, I guess it was sort of central BC for a summer on an aggregate project. And it was sort of like it was junior geo type stuff. So I was logging a bit of core and doing a bit of mapping, a little bit of everything, cutting samples, even like um, just a touch of everything. It wasn't super glamorous work, but while I was there, I met one of the senior guys. Um, Completely forget his name now, Dave something. Anyway, but so he put me in touch with this company that was getting going with a bunch of projects in BC, and I ended up going over to them, this company called Geoinformatics, and they were really neat place to work. So they had a software company. They started as a software company called Fractal Graphics, and they had this 3D software like a precursor to Leapfrog kind of called Fraxis. And it was like at the time, this was 2006, I guess, ish, 5 or 6. At the time, it was sort of state of the art 3D software. And anyways, they had used that and some very statistically based methods to win the Gold Corp challenge in 2000. So they won $1 million at this Gold Corp challenge, and then the team that did that used the fame and the prize money as to get started to sort of reinvent themselves as an explorer. And then at the time when I ended up working for them, they had just entered a deal with Kennecott to explore. I think it was 20 of their kind of high potential but underexplored projects. They had 2 years to do it, and they were sort of obligated to spend, I think it was 20 million. They needed to spend 20 million on 20 projects over a 2 year period. And that was when I entered the picture with them. So it was really interesting. They're all porphyry projects. There was Whistler in Alaska. There was a few projects in BC. There's Clayule and Redton and a couple others. Clayule's still getting work. It had some good results from Pacific Ridge in the summer. This past summer, they drilled some good holes into it. And then there's some projects in Mexico that came from Kennecott as well. So what I ended up doing with GXL was I was doing a lot of field work and core logging in BC, and then they would send me to their Mexican projects in the winter time when the field season closed down in BC. So I keep doing that work on those projects and then go back and forth. And I did that for a couple, 3 years. Yeah. And then anyways, so it was a really interesting time. I learned Spanish and picked up a lot about data collection and being systematic about it. Saw a lot of rocks, learned a lot about porphyries, traveled a bit. It was very interesting stuff. And then, so coming in to the end of the deal that they had with Kennecott, there was some eccentricities in the way that they financed it. They'd used a convertible debenture, which meant that there was interest payments coming due on $20 million worth of a loan, and it was a junior that had just spent 20 million on exploration, and nobody monetizes anything in 2 years, right? So it was basically the company was not in good shape at that point because of the way this deal had been structured. So I don't know all the details of what happened in the boardroom there, but essentially what happened is that the investors that had loaned the 20 million essentially liquidated the company, took over the company, and then ended up merging it with Rimfire, and it became Kiska Metals. Is what happened. But yeah, I left when this was all starting to happen because it was pretty clear that things were going sideways, and then the GFC was also starting to kick off in a big way, and I had a chance to work in close to home in Manitoba on a well site consulting job, so doing well site geology. So anyways, that's what I ended up doing. I guess it was '08. I headed back to Manitoba, and I was a well site consultant for like 3 years, drilling horizontal wells in the Williston Basin for Bakken oil. And that was kind of like a very, very different experience. It was like really interesting in some regards, and then really dull in other regards. Like the tech that was being used in the oil industry then and still is like light years ahead of hard rock. So like you're directionally drilling, you've got a whole bunch of live data streams that are coming through. Like there's a gamma unit attached to the drill string or to the bottom hole assembly, and rate of penetration and gas is almost live, and all kinds of data is coming at you in a nearly live sense, which is cool. And it's steering a well with a high degree of precision, this kind of thing. So it was cool to see that, and I think there's been some work in that space trying to bring that kind of tech across. I forget the name of the outfit, but there's someone in Australia was working on getting coiled tube directional drilling happening for the hard rock environment, which would be pretty nifty. And then like lots of live analysis work has been happening. So I think some of that tech is slowly leaking through to hard rock. But soft rock has just they've had so much more budget for so much longer that their tech is far in advance of ours. But so anyway, that was kind of like an interesting takeaway from the soft rock years. And then something else that's a little bit more on the philosophical side, I guess, is that like I noticed then and still notice now that in the hard rock exploration side, you can get away with a lot of like waffling on things. Like, I don't know, I've had so many conversations. I won't name any names, but like some really good geos out there that'll lay out like a really good story on a project or whatever, based on the limited evidence that's in hand, and then kind of negate everything that they just said because you can, and it's kind of covers you, I guess. If you attack every problem from the perspective that it could be anything, the answer could be anything, then you're never wrong, I guess. And that's something that just doesn't fly when you're in a production environment. So it was like a pretty neat takeaway from soft rock, because if you're in a drilling rig and you're drilling like 100 meters per hour, and somebody asks you if you need to, steer upward or downward, it's a very simple question, but up is right or wrong, and you don't really know. You just take what evidence you've got in hand, make an educated guess, and if you're right, awesome, and if you're wrong, you have to fix it. But you can't tell them, well, it could be up or down. Like nobody can do that in a production environment. So anyway, like working in soft rock is useful in that regard, because it really forces you to make decisions. And I guess the same is probably true of a mining production environment. But yeah, exploration, I mean, this is a pet peeve of mine in the exploration environment, that it's almost too easy to get away with being waffly, if that's I'm not sure if that's a word, but you know,
It's definitely a word that we use.
right. It's the
So
thing that
therefore it
happens.
is a word.
This is a thing that definitely happens. So yeah, so soft rock was interesting from that regard, but geologically it was pretty dull. So the average dip of bedding in the Williston Basin is 0.3 degrees, and it's I don't know, like you'd hit a 1 degree difference from that or something, and it's just like, oh, hit the panic button because it's so monotonous, the geology there. It was not that exciting. So anyway, I did that for 3 years. The GFC was kind of cooling off, and then I was really itching to get back to hard rock. And it turns out that some of my former colleagues um, from First Quantum were working, or from Geoinformatics were working with this company called First Quantum Minerals, and they were uh, they had some successful producing mines in Africa in the Zambian copper belt, and still do. And then at the time they were just moving into South America, so they bought a small junior, I guess, called it Minera, and their project was Hakira in the Andahuaylas Yauri belt. So they took on this porphyry in Peru, and they were needing some help with like training the local teams on using digital logging and oriented core procedures and this kind of thing. And because they knew that I was across this from the GXL years and was bilingual in Spanish, they gave me a call, and I ended up joining First Quantum, I think July of 2011, and heading to Peru. So I spent a few years with them in Peru, and then um, transferred when they bought Minera Inmet to get Cobre Panama in, I think it was 2013. And then at the start of 2014, I headed across to the Chilean office that came with that deal and worked out of Santiago for the next few years. But it was First Quantum though that really got me into geochem. So at that stage, they were doing a lot of work with Scott Halley, and he would come across. He was really a good teacher, as you know, and really shared a lot of knowledge with us about trace elements and pathfinders and shortwave infrared stuff like TerraSpec type analysis. And that kind of really got the seeds of geochem planted with me was those years, definitely. And started learning about that stuff and realized how useful it was, and I just kind of stuck with it. So like you said before, I never really called myself a geochemist, but I'm more like a practically minded guy that just wants to find deposits, and if something seems like it's going to be really useful for that, like geochem, then I'll learn as much as I need to or can that's going to help towards that. So kind of got that going. And actually, I just wanted to put in a plug. I just a team of industry and academics and myself just published yesterday a paper in the Explorer newsletter that's
I saw that this morning and I
Did you
started
see it?
reading it. And I was like, no, you have some stuff to do right now.
It's
Yeah.
very timely. Yeah.
Yes.
So, but it's what it is. It's the paper kind of introduces the theme and like covers the topic a little bit, and then there's a link in there somewhere that goes to a manual for processing the outputs from TSG and has templates and stuff along with it. So it's like just like more or less start to finish set of tools there for building workflows. And also, I guess the other thing about that is that we're just talking. So we have this little group and we talk about this stuff because, you know, spectroscopy. And there's this like recurring theme where you get a data set, and I'm sure you've hit this as well, where you see some data. There's been no QA/QC measures taken. It might be from several years or several instruments, and you inevitably end up having to deal with them as separate subsets because they're apples to oranges. But I guess with this, what we were trying to get across is that it's actually fairly easy to implement some QA/QC, and then that makes it possible to correct data from different instruments and different years and things, and end up using apples to apples data. So this is like an appealing thing to me as an ML guy too. Right? Sorry.
Yeah, and I think I'll also add to that for everybody that's listening with us right now is that it's not just handheld that you see this in, that I work quite a bit with a bunch of scanning tech. And right now I'm working with one of these companies to implement consistent, because what people do is they think it's just enough to calibrate with Spectralon. Something that you need to check as well is that the Spectralon is clean, because even these scanning companies that you think are so advanced, they're not always so advanced. Clean Spectralon, and that's calibrating. But these companies don't always think that they need standards as well to make sure that the bands are in the correct position. So right now I'm working with a company to implement standards. And then a cool thing that I've been doing recently is also doing something like a field duplicate tray. And I learned this from working with a few companies when I was at CoreScan. And so this field duplicate is just like an additional thing for everybody to look at, to have confidence in the fact that a kaolinite is a kaolinite is a kaolinite kind of thing. So whether you're working with the seemingly very advanced scanning companies or just with a handheld, it's QA/QC is really important, and don't expect anybody to be doing it. Hopefully going forward that will be true.
Yeah, let's work
a
towards
well-made
that
point.
future. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I didn't realize you're doing that, so we should keep talking about this. It became a pet peeve when I started trying to do ML work on spectral data. I was just kind of blissfully ignorant prior to doing that, and then when you start digging into it, you realize that it's actually quite important to have good QA/QC on spectral data. So
Well, it's also that, before, because a lot of these scanning companies want to immediately do ML work, and it's like, well, hold on, we can't do that until we have good data, and we've proven that we have good data. But even just going and picking out matches, but particularly the matches in general should be fine, but compositional data.
Your cat's adorable.
To everybody that's listening right now, my cat has taken up half the screen and he is just hanging out. Having a great time. Getting back to it though, the compositional data is really hard to use at that point too, because just because you can see that you have a white mica, it doesn't mean that the position of the 2200 nanometer feature is meaningful in terms of, is it a paragonite, muscovite, or a phengite? So it's really important to do QA/QC with this. Who knew that we were going to get into this right now? But I think it's really a really great point that you've brought up.
Absolutely, it's important. Yeah.
This could be a whole nother thing that we talk about, but not today.
This could be an episode in itself.
Exactly. I'll get one of my friends from the SWIR scanning companies. We'll sit them down. We can bring you back, and then we'll have a whole new episode. Love it.
Roundtable
on SWIR QA/QC.
For younger listeners, so QA/QC, we keep using that acronym, but it's quality assurance and quality control, and it's just the idea that instruments don't always consistently take the same value for the same material, and then there's different reasons for that, like instrument drift, like things can just expand and contract inside of any instrument. This happens for analytical instruments of any kind, really, but that's why it's important to have samples in there that the composition of, to sort of set your expectations of what that machine should produce. And that's essentially what, I guess, in a nutshell, what we're talking about with QA/QC. Hey, Sam, is there?
I think that you did a great job, and without jumping in too much into the intricacies of SWIR.
It's a soft description of QA/QC.
But yeah, no, that's really great. It's important for all of your geochemistry, all your SWIR, anything that you're doing in life, actually. You'll oftentimes even see in your shirts when you get them QA/QC approved or something. So QC is really important.
Yeah.
All right. We talked
and your cat definitely agrees with that.
He definitely agrees. He's agreeing so much that he's like, I can start to take a nap at this point. This is what he's saying.
He's peering into my soul right now.
It's just like, I must make sure that this episode stays on the rails. It's good.
This is the director.
Director, producer, everything. Look, if I didn't have him up here with us, he might just be meowing somewhere in the background, and that's way harder to get
No,
out. Yeah.
this
But about
is
a
great.
minute of talking about him, I feel that I haven't done that at this point, and it's what his due is. Okay, no, you can't sleep on the keyboard. That is just not. Just come sleep on this computer. I brought this one for you. So yeah, sleep right there. Okay. All right. So this is
Yeah.
an excellent introduction, Mac, and I think that our listeners will get a lot out of it in the sense that I think that, you know, when you're much older and younger people are looking at you and it just seems like, okay, you haven't made, you have a great job, you're doing this, you're doing that. Everything just must have been easy. And I think that yours really showed that you didn't even get to spend your entire career in hard rock. You worked in soft rock in a seemingly very, very boring job for a long time. But also, I agree. When I was working with CoreScan, I got to see a bunch of stuff in soft rock, and their tech is really incredible. So anyway, that was an excellent introduction. Let's see what tea you've brought, and it's time to dish it.
I think if it's okay with you, I'm going to tell you one of my favorite discovery stories. It's not really geochemical, well, it kind of is, but
Tea doesn't have to be about geochemistry. It is what it is.
It's just tea.
It's just
Okay.
tea.
Gotcha. Cool. All right, so I'm going to sort of pseudo-anonymize this too. I think a lot of people will probably figure out what I'm talking about, but so this is coming to me. This is tea that I learned at the water cooler from a former colleague who'd been at this site shortly after its discovery in when was that? I guess mid 2000s. Anyway, so there's this really significant sedimentary copper deposit in the Congo discovered by Ivanhoe. And the story goes is that there's some really solid geological work went into to the discovery. There's there was a case for being there in the district based on the stratigraphy and the structure. They were looking for domes, and domes are something that might provide a structural trap for fluids that carry copper. So there's a whole lot of really careful thought that went into it. And the story goes that there was all this thought. There was the selection of the district. There was, I think, a stream sediment sampling program to sort of winnow down to a bit smaller areas, and then some detailed work on those areas that were anomalous in stream sediments to come up with structurally based drill targets. And then there were some drilling campaigns, and the drilling campaigns came up pretty not uninteresting, I guess. They had some sniffs of copper. It's not a lot going on, and the company was at the point of walking away, and they had one or two more holes left, and I gather morale was kind of bad on site, and the geo in charge hit the sauce one night and couldn't make it out of bed the next morning, and the rig was moving to the next drill pad. It was either the last or second last site that they were going to drill. And instead of going to the drill site and making sure it was set up properly and in the right orientation, he just says to the drill supervisor, you know what, just go and move it to the picket. You know where it is. Do your thing. Rock and roll. I'm going to be here dealing with a hangover. Anyway, so the drill soup goes out. They set up the rig on the next site. He sets it up backwards. He's drilling the opposite direction of what the plan was, because he's a drill supervisor. He doesn't really care which way they're drilling. It's on the right picket, right? So they're drilling backwards, and and they hit like a really significant intercept of copper, like a game-changing intercept of copper on sort of like the very last gasp of this exploration project that would have, if you drilled in the right direction, they might have lingered and might have gotten lucky, but chances are pretty good that they would have written off a massive exploration expenditure and moved on, and this giant copper mine wouldn't have been discovered. So I just love that story because it's an illustration of how, like, beyond doing good geological work, there's an element of luck involved in a lot of this because, we're in such a data sparse environment that sometimes you just need to get lucky as well as doing the right things to be in the right spot. But that's my tea.
I've never heard this tea. I'm glad that we've now shared it with all of our listeners. That is not to say, young listeners, that it is good to hit the sauce very heavy.
No, I'm not encouraging that.
No, we're not encouraging that. But that is very interesting. Thank you.
I think there's probably a lot more stories out there like that, where it's, there's this serendipitous thing that happens that makes a huge difference, right? Or somebody just decides to drill another shift and it changes the whole story. Hey, I suspect it's more common than we think. But
just need to hang out around a bit more water coolers, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very cool. So now we're going to transition to our last segment, and we've never talked about with somebody one of their own papers before. So I think this is really cool and novel that we get to talk to something near and dear to your heart, but it's also very topical because I think another thing that is starting to come into play in geoscience, but hasn't been as big, say, as if you go onto Google and you Google dog and you have all these segmentations that are, or in CNNs that are bringing you right to pictures with dogs. Now, though, starting to work with our very rich data sets of geological imagery, there's just so much that can be done. And I think it's very cool that the topic of your research so far has been the integration of not only this very cool piece of data science as a whole using imagery, but also integrating it with geochemistry. And I think we're very excited all to hear more about this. So the title of the paper is Random Forest Rock Type Classification with Integration of Geochemical and Photographic Data. And then for those that have not yet read the paper, first of all, I just have to congratulate you and your co-authors for writing a machine learning paper that is easily digestible while still being thorough. I've read now a lot of ML papers, and I know I feel that even I now have learned a lot by reading yours, and I just truly feel, because look, while smart, I am not, ML type. That's just not really what I do, right? So, yep. And it's just the fact that I think, kind of coming back to the fact that normal geoscientists now have a paper that they can reference and that they can digest about very complex topics is amazing. So thank you. And as a bonus, you all did a really fantastic job of outlining, presenting your PXRF QA/QC, which also I think is amazing. We talked a little bit about QA/QC before, but that's like another thing that you just have to, with all these things that are very simple, people just expect you to know everything. And if you're having to ask these questions, then, you're not part of the club or something like that. Listeners, always ask about all these very basic things because they are so unbelievably important, and you are not stupid, any other adjective you want to use for not knowing about them, because we've taken it as an industry to be like, oh, this is just so simple, we're not going to outline this process. So thank you guys for actually outlining it.
No worries.
All this said, could you give a brief introduction to the paper and some of the key takeaways?
Yeah, sure. Maybe just if you don't mind, I might just pick apart what you just said a little bit too, because great. The making an ML paper accessible was something that we really made a concerted effort to do. And the reasons for that, I mean, it's just a good idea to make things understandable, right? But there's I think a lot of precedent in mineral exploration trying to adopt ML techniques and missing the mark because there isn't enough understanding from the geoscientific side of what data science is, and there isn't enough understanding of what exploration geology is from the data science perspective. So that's something that it's near and dear to me, because I'm coming at data science or machine learning from the perspective of being a mid-career exploration geologist type of thing. And I don't really I really just want to know how to use these tools properly so that they're going to help us discover ore bodies. And I want other people to know that too, because there's a lot of useful things that can happen, but there's this language barrier that's been in place because these are super different disciplines. One of them is highly numeric and data driven. The other one is, a lot of gut feels and interpretive input, subjectivity. So trying to make these two things align and get an optimum result is hard. So anyway, that's just a really long-winded way of saying that's pretty much why we were really focused on trying to get the paper into a shape where it could be understood by a geoscientist or a data scientist. So hopefully we achieve that and but yeah, so the paper, basically what I'm trying to do with the paper is show that composition as a means of separating out rock types is fine in many situations, but in a lot of situations it struggles where there is compositional similarity between your rock types. So like in the paper, I'm taking it was a diorite and then its volcanic equivalent, and showing that, yeah, okay, so you can separate them algorithmically or manually, kind of, on the geochemistry, but it's a lot easier and you get a better result if you involve the texture, because one is, equigranular and the other is porphyritic. And that's something that the geochemistry is blind to. So I think that's kind of where I was getting at with that. So I guess some takeaways from it. So the data acquisition was important. We were using another sort of thing with that research was that I wanted to do that with like rapid analytical techniques or in-field techniques. So we used an XRF, a handheld XRF for compositional data, and then used just a handheld camera, which this actual camera, for the photos, and then marked a circle every meter down the core, took a picture of that circle within that circle using this. So this is a cool camera. I am not endorsed by Olympus or anything, but I just think it's a really cool camera. It's a TG6, and it doesn't have it on right now, but there's an attachment that I screw onto the lens that's an LED ring light. And what that means is that if you're taking a picture of core, you can put it flat against the core, and then the illumination and focal distance is the same every single time, which is ideal for machine learning purposes. You've got apples to apples images. Anyway, so that was a cool camera to use. And then the paper takes those images, and then I built up a workflow in KNIME that'll extract some standard textural metrics from the images, and then basically merge it with the compositional data taken from those same locations using the XRF, and then use them. You experiment with the input features for I used a random forest to train for lithology, and see what the difference is in the accuracy depending on which subset of features that you use. So that was kind of the gist of it. In terms of learnings, it's maybe before I get into that, I'll just say that a challenge with composition and texture, or anything really that comes from imagery, is that imagery is unstructured data. So most of the image parsing techniques that are used in, like you alluded before to, the Google search, this type of thing, indexing by what a network thinks is in a picture. These are all based on neural nets because they do really well with unstructured data. You can train a neural net, it can parse a picture and pick things apart. The problem, if you want to use chemistry with texture, you've got chemistry, which is structured data, it's tabular, and neural nets perform terribly with structured data. And then you've got unstructured data, which is the images, and there's really no way to get them together. So the way that we dealt with this was just basically extracting textures from the images and making it into structured data. And that way you can combine it with the chemistry, and then you can use fairly standard algorithms on it, and I opted for a random forest just because I do a lot of machine learning work with my research and with my work with Goldspot, and generally random forests are really effective and fairly robust and tend to produce a good result. So I tested a bunch of algorithms and opted for random forest because it's a nice algorithm, and in a way it sort of mimics, I think, natural thought. It's hierarchical in nature, and a lot of geological problems are hierarchical. So I tend to view it as being probably even a better proxy for the way people think is a tree, you know, as opposed to, so a neural network. That's the other thing about neural networks, is that the exciting thing that, that supposedly the neurons are modeled after the human brain, and it's tended to mimic the actual physical structure of a brain in some way, going back to Donald Hebb in the 50s, I think, started talking about the structure of the neuron. And that may be true, but actually, in terms of the way people think, at least for me, I think in a fairly hierarchical way. So I'm looking at a rock type, and then I'm looking at alteration because that's largely dependent on the rock type. And then I'm going down a level and looking at mineralization because that's dependent on the rock type and the alteration, sort of thing. So I'm thinking about exploration problems are generally hierarchical and layered like that, I think. And for that reason, I believe that in a lot of cases, random forests are good at sort of replicating that thought process in a certain way. But anyway, so that's kind of my plug on random forests. But yeah, so some takeaways I think that were probably noteworthy were that, so I started the research thinking that I'd have a like a bivariate classifier or something, or a set of XY diagrams for classifying rock type, and like a Halley type approach where you might plot scandium against thorium, phosphorus, whatever, and then so do that, but then also have like a metric for coarse grainedness or something, and then make some bivariate plots of those, and then start seeing groupings jump out. It turns out that textural extractions are really powerful in multivariate space, but in sort of bivariate or even three variable space, they're not that useful. So if you really want to get improvements in your classifications, it's probably not going to come from extracting the texture and making an XY or a ternary plot even that involves texture and composition, because there's still going to be a lot of smearing. But if you take a whole whack of textural metrics out of your images and then parse them in multivariate space, then you're going to get a much better result. And the reason I think for that is that there's a whole bunch of different aspects of images that can be quantified, but no single metric quantifies everything, I guess, or even a majority of the data. So you need to run a variety of extractions types, and then it becomes powerful in multivariate space. So if that makes sense.
And it does to me. We have this classical geochemistry approach, the way that a lot of us have been taught, and I'm getting this frustration where I just want everything to be plotting in bivariate or ternary space, because that's the way. But with the way that I've learned to treat hyperspectral data, and that's kind of carried over into the way now that I've been treating geochemistry data in different situations, not all situations, but I've been having this internal battle with myself because I can't bring it back to that bivariate space. But I think the point is that you don't have to, and it doesn't make it wrong to not have in the bivariate space. It's just different styles. So I like that idea. That's just that if it works if the way in which you work is in a bivariate ternary workflow, that is how you work. But there's also this other workflow that's emerged now for those that have started down this machine learning path that just presents different options, and it doesn't make it wrong. It sounds like a pep talk. Doesn't make it wrong to be using this multivariate space, and
Yeah.
I think that it just presents other options, not necessarily better, but other options for using these data sets. So I do like this point that you've made. And I think but bringing it back a little bit further, one thing, because we were talking about that you've used PXRF data for this. The other thing that I just want see if you can comment on is that I've looked now at many a PXRF data set. I think the way in which it's first presented is that it's a broad-based technique. You can use all the elements. The people that are Olympus teams, Thermal Scientific, that are coming to your site and are giving you a basic calibration. Is this basic calibration enough? And can you use all the elements that PXRF gives to you? And I think that this is a very instructive thing that we can just talk about briefly right now for everybody.
Yeah, that's red meat right there. That's good. So yeah, so no, like definitely not. The calibration, the factory calibrations are sort of 80-20 rule calibrations. They do it 80% of the job with 20% of the effort. And if you want to really do something good with XRF data, you definitely need to include QAQC. Coming back to QAQC.
Love it.
And yeah, evaluate those elements that you're getting back against your QAQC samples. There's some that you're going to need to throw out right away, and there's others that you can correct. And there'll be maybe one or two that is just like the great white shark, naturally perfect. But yeah, you definitely need to do that, go through that process. So funny story, maybe a little more on the T side again.
I love it.
Funny story here. So I was working on this paper in, when was it? Would have been the fall of last year, I suppose. And I was getting some pressure from Matt, my supervisor, to get it out there. And I was really close. And the only real thing that I was missing was working up the QAQC results on my XRF data. So I was just like, I got this deadline coming. I'm just going to just wrap this up and submit it. Yeah. Anyway, so one of my reviewers at Computers and Geoscience, Applied Computing and Geosciences, one of the guys that reviewed it was Michael Gaisley, who you know.
Oh, yes.
And who is well across the XRF stuff. Like,
yeah.
I actually asked for him to do it.
It's like the king of XRF.
King of XRF.
Yeah.
And he just ruthlessly gutted my first draft on the lack of rigor that I put into the XRF. And it was fair. Like, it needed to happen. I knew that I was going to have to go back and do it. And so I got these edits back, and then really sat down. And it was Christmas time now, and I had some time off from work, and I had time to actually sit down and figure it out. And I spent a couple weeks just sorting out the XRF QAQC. I wrote some code that would do most of it for me and properly, and just really got it sorted out. Reran all my experiments, and my results were way, way better. So me being kind of lazy in the first draft, doing sloppy QAQC, produced results that were pretty weird and kind of ambiguous. And then doing it properly, doing QAQC, fixing all this data, doing CLR on the variables that I chose, this kind of thing, just made a huge difference in the outcome of the paper. And the results actually made a lot of sense. So that's yeah.
And for those that don't know about a CLR.
Okay, so CLR, this is another thing that comes up a lot with compositional data. So basically the idea is that if you've got features that are dependent, and so say you take an analysis of a rock, and you've got the major element components of that rock, everything adds up to 100%. And what that means in the real world is that if you add or remove any one of these components, the other ones need to adjust to accommodate that change because the sum of everything is 100%. So in effect, they're dependent, they're linked. And CLR is a mathematical method of so it's called closed data. The CLR is a mathematical method of opening the data, or sort of separating these dependencies between variables. And it's in some cases it's really useful and really important. In other cases, it's less vital, but it stands for centered log ratio, and I kind of forget the formula off the top of my head, but it's basically the purpose of it is the opening up closed data.
Let's just transition into asking some of the questions from the paper. So we got 4 questions here.
Yep.
And I want to start out by talking about core logging.
Yeah.
First, thanks for providing me with one of my favorite topics on which to focus on.
Yeah.
And before we get into the science of what you've done, can you explain to our listeners as to why this is a crucial area for research?
I think this sort of segues nicely into what you're about to ask, because the discussion about core logging, because this is important. This research is important because we are often in situations where we're acquiring a lot of information and then making expensive decisions on that information. And if we're acquiring this information, this data, making these decisions based on it, we need to use it to the best of use it for what it is. And a lot of the time, I think decisions are made on some of the data, but then a whole pile of subjectivity that goes into the interpretive side of it. So I'm not promoting that geologists need to be replaced by compositional data and algorithms. I'm saying that for tasks that involve large volumes of data and should be done in a fairly consistent manner, I think algorithms and some good quality data collection can definitely provide a solution there. And that leaves the geologists to do things that really need to be interpretive and subjective. So I guess what I'm advocating is that we use the data to the best of its ability, and then focus as humans on what we do best, which is interpreting things that come our way. So is that
yeah. And I guess my feeling on this as well, for those that don't already know my feelings on core logging, is that especially initially when we're looking at core, our eyes, yes, we can identify certain minerals, but we can't identify all the minerals. Particularly, you get into the very fine grain minerals, clays, and then even, to extent, if you forget to bring your magnet that day, fine grain magnetite, you can miss that. There's lots of things that you'll miss in the core. And so it really starts out with that first step of it being an interpretation already. And then from that, you're then building interpretations upon interpretation. So I really like the idea of using data to help you when you're logging to identify minerals and therefore textures appropriately, and then taking that and moving on to the next steps using that data. So I thought that your paper starting with that was really pertinent towards. And there's also the aspect too of, saving time, because as geologists, we're asked to do everything from core logging to, managing budgets, managing providers. Where does the time of day come in where you can actually sit down and figure out what your geologic model looks like? Yeah. And I think that anything that we can get towards helping us spend less time actually logging and doing a better job of logging is going to be a big win for the industry.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then from experience, I'm curious as to whether you experienced issues with your photography as inputs to your model. And likewise, are there issues that you foresee for those who want to use your approach with historic photography data sets?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the capture of photography, as I'm sure you're aware, is like um, historically pretty inconsistent. Drill core photography. So again, for the younger listeners, like kind of part of a standard workflow in a core shed is cores drilled, a bunch of stuff happens to it in the core shed, it gets sampled, sent to the lab. But one of those steps is that photos are taken of the boxes. So there's a lot of core photo data floating around. And I think now people are starting to work with it more and more and realize that it can be a valuable resource because often you can't go back to the actual cores. They get sampled and then maybe left in the bush. So you don't have access to the physical core. So the best representation might be a picture that's been taken 10 years ago or more, you know. So there's photos going back that my first job as a student, the head geo was taking photos of this historic core from the nickel belt with an old Pentax, and then he'd get the photos developed, and one of our tasks was like gluing them into albums that were labeled with the drill hole and the meterage. So
Wow.
that's dating me a lot, but but I mean, photos were being taken. This is going back only 20 years or something. But anyway, so there's heaps of photos out there. But the point is that the quality varies a ton, and the light angle and the type of camera and the resolution and focal distance, all these things. So for my project, I was able to sidestep that by using this funky camera with the ring light on it. I was able to take really consistent photos, and I was taking photos on cut core, so I got good contact between the camera and the core, and then because of that, everything was consistent, so that worked well. But in the vast majority of historical photos are going to be a lot less systematic. So I guess for people that want to do this sort of work, I would say like going forward, make sure that you're taking really good photos. And that what that might mean on a core shed scale is like having an RGB card in your box somewhere so that you can color correct, and then taking it with a consistent setup so you're using the same distance and the same lighting sources. And just being super, super consistent, because they don't have to be perfect. They just have to be apples to apples. That's the main thing if you're going to use things for machine learning. So if there's some flaw in what you're doing, it's probably okay as long as the same flaw is in every photo type of thing. So there's some wiggle room there. So I'd say going forward, take really a good effort to take consistent photos. With historic photos, it's a lot more challenging. There needs to be a lot of correction done, possibly. I was lucky I didn't need to delve into that much. I work with Goldspot as well now, and they're doing a lot in that space and have done a good job of building code that deals with picking up blocks and removing it from the image, or the edge effects, linearizing, dealing with glare. So that there's solutions out there. They're really hard to implement as an individual. I would suggest if you do get in that situation, reach out to someone like Goldspot. There's other options as well, but someone who can professionally deal with correcting your photos before you try to do anything sophisticated with the textures, unless you're just really happy with the quality of your photos, which is a possibility, I guess, but maybe a slim possibility. So
I would argue from the photos that I've seen over the years, slim possibility. And I would also say that there's some really inexpensive options out there now for, and I'm not talking about people coming around to your core shed and taking photos. I'm talking about there's systems out there now that are just photography based that you can get to scan your core just for photography.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a very cool option. And then I would say as well that something that all companies should be doing is that there are quite a few providers out there now that take in your old photography and they put it into these online cloud-based platforms. So instead of seeing all your photography in folders, which you'll never go back through to look, now you can begin to just be able to actually see them. So if you do lose your core, if your core is just stored in just some way in which you'll never see it again, but it's just so helpful to also just go back and see it even before you're going to go to the next step and do some machine learning style stuff with it. I would seek out said providers as well and just know that this is an option that we now have. And I think it's an important one.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Yeah.
And as a follow-up question towards talking about photography, do you think that including UV or hyperspectral images rather than images that just have these 3 bands of data, the red, green, blue, is a natural next step for your PhD?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So the first case study I did that we're talking about was done with point data acquired on cores in field techniques. So the one that I'm working on now is a different project with a different set of data, but it's using hyperspectral imagery from CoreScan actually, and wet chem, laboratory chem, and what else? I guess that's the main thing. But because of the hyperspectral imagery, there's a lot more that we can do for sure. So you can look at textures on different bands, look at textures of specific minerals once you've mineral matched them, and look for relationships there. So it's an absolutely natural progression to go to that. And it's largely the same problem. It's just the data volume's a lot larger. So the main challenge is data wrangling when you move to these larger data sets. Point data is pretty lean, so it's easy. You can run a lot of things quickly and locally. But with the hyperspectral imagery, for instance, it's pretty dense and it just requires a lot more processing power and time to deal with. But it's essentially the same problem. It's extremely useful data. So, and then I guess the other thing to mention is that with lithology, which my first paper dealt with, things are pretty crisp and contacts are relatively discrete. Alteration's a whole nother beast because especially in a hydrothermal magmatic system, alteration is gradational, right? As you're aware, you'll go from whatever assemblage to whatever other assemblage, but instead of being a crisp line somewhere, relatively crisp, it's just gradually becoming that. So if you've got imagery, you can sort of work with that and come up with logical ways of making those breaks that make sense in terms of the system and do a pretty good job of breaking apart alteration assemblages in space. But no, it's definitely where things are headed. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that working with a lot of different people, especially I saw it a lot in skarns and porphyries that I was working in Chile particularly, they just had, even with their lithology, they couldn't pick it apart because it had so many overprinting alterations on it that they couldn't pick out the alteration either. So, no, that's really neat. I think that this line of thinking and then also just line of work being done is just going to be so valuable to the industry. And then because it is academic in nature, it becomes available more widely. And I think that that's just incredibly powerful. So thank you for your service.
I hope so. Yeah, like I hope this kind of stuff gets adopted because I mean, everyone's got these horror stories from their junior geo days where they had to log 200 meters a day for 6 months or something. And then at the end of the day realize that your logs don't really match your buddy's logs from across the core shed because you're both human and have different ways and different levels of experience. And it's frustrating to spend that much time working on something to realize that it's probably not consistent enough to link up in 3D with your buddy kind of thing. I
mean, not only that, but I've seen exploration programs where because they were lacking of time and they had 100,000 meters, they had 2 rotations of 8 geologists each, and they weren't junior geos. They were full-on geos, and there's just no way that there was anywhere near complete agreement. And I've heard also the stories of taking your top geos at major companies and going down to a project and logging it, and then also seeing completely different interpretations of results. So yeah,
Highly interpretive.
Highly interpretive.
Like going back to Hakira there's I don't know how many kilometers worth of core there. I'm not sure how many times that deposit was relogged, but it's a lot. Like that's a huge investment of people's time and money in trying to get something that you can model in 3D. And I think that's pretty typical. I suspect that's typical.
It is very typical, and one of the things that I would speak to clients over and over again is that you can continue to relog, because a lot of people with hyperspectral imaging, whatever company it is that, oh, this is very expensive and the cost is precluding. But you know what, it is also very expensive? Relogging something 5 times.
Absolutely.
It's a major expense, but you don't see it because it happens over many, many years.
Yeah.
And it's just
salaries and
yeah, totally.
Imagine how much work they could do if they did spend, 5 man years relogging core or whatever. Yeah. And probably still not really have a super definitive model at the end of the day. So,
probably not, because you're always going back to the same error. And it's not that geologists are bad again at their work. It's just that, for example, when you're in that porphyry in Chile and you have 3 to 4 different overprinting events, and who can do that?
Yeah. So this is where you want to go empirical with it. So take your data, whatever it may be, do it, break it up empirically, and then send back your super duper geos, and they can take a look at it, figure out what those breaks actually mean in the real world, compare them, make those observations that provide geological context to those breaks. But at least if you're starting from an empirical kind of groupings or whatever, you've got that foundation to build on, instead of starting with the subjective thing and then trying to build it into something. And like you're saying before, layering up layer upon layer of interpretation until you end up with, God knows what.
But hopefully something that's more than you had before.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. So your study found that photography and PXRF data separately did not perform as well as the combined model that included both data sets. Still, though, the model performance was about 90%. Could you talk about what you think would further improve model performance?
Yeah, so the kind of interesting thing that fell out of that case study is that, okay, so actually these rocks that I was looking at did have some chemical differences that made them made geochemistry perform relatively well out of the box. So improving it, adding texture to the story improved the model a little bit. It was already pretty good. But the sort of use case here and where you would see it being more impactful is as you get more and more similar compositions in your project, then bringing texture into the picture makes a bigger difference. So, like as an example, another project I've been working on, it's a multi-phase porphyry stock that's been intruded into a volcanic pile derived from the same underlying magma chamber. So you've got intrusives so you've got 6 or 7 intrusive types, or porphyry dikes, that have pretty much the same composition as each other. And then they're hosted by volcanic rocks that have pretty much the same composition also. So, but they're all really different texturally. So this is more like the use case that I'm talking about with this type of work, where it'll be, I think this will be in my next paper, but so where things are super similar like that compositionally, then texture really makes an impact. So in this case, I'm going from something like a 60% accuracy using composition up to 90 plus with composition plus texture, and that's just mainly because there's a lot more compositional similarity in these rocks than in my first case study. So if you're in a project where there's actually a lot of compositional differences and you only have a couple of 3 rock types, then it's probably not unnecessary, right? But if you're getting into these situations where there's a lot of overlap, then yeah, and that can happen in a lot of cases. Like even you can simulate a igneous composition with a sedimentary rock, right? If it's derived from, volcaniclastic fragments or whatever, you can pretty easily have a sedimentary rock and a volcanic rock that have the exact same chemical composition or very similar. And it's this kind of thing where I think
Yeah, I
texture.
actually know of a project that I worked on a few months ago now, and that one I was talking with friends of mine that had previously worked the project and just get their opinion on things because there was a silico paper out there. No drama to the silico, right, or anything, but there's silico paper out there, and it had the stratigraphy very horizontal, and also for the porphyry dikes very vertical.
Yeah.
But then I had known some people that had worked the project, so I was talking to them about what they felt about what was going on, and their strong feeling was that some of the things that were marked as volcanics were actually indeed sedimentary, that were just so altered that they appeared volcanic, and that was just based on their textural observations, but it was just so blown over with so many overprinting alteration events that it was an absolute nightmare. But also, yeah,
alteration's hard.
Alteration is super hard.
Yeah, and it's always it's the last alteration event that you see the most strongly in any data set, right? Including texture. So
absolutely,
it's a tricky one. It's pretty hard to unravel.
How do you say KNIME? Would you just Nime? Okay.
I guess. I don't know.
Okay.
That's what I said.
We'll get made fun of, I'm sure. Could you discuss further the Nime workflow that you developed and whether you think it's easy enough to use that it can be broadly applied in mineral exploration?
Yeah, sure. So no, it's pretty straightforward. So Nime is like it's codeless and it's a data mining software. It's open source. It's from a university in Switzerland, I think. But yeah, it's the workflow itself is pretty straightforward. It basically takes in photos from a directory, extracts the texture, and then takes in the tabular compositional data and merges it with the textures that are extracted from the photos, and then runs a pretty straightforward set of random forest algorithms on those to predict whatever it is you're trying to predict, lithology in this case. So it's fairly straightforward to take that and adapt it to new problems. And again, it's codeless, so users that just want to get started and have a look at it and kind of start wrapping their head around this sort of thing, or even machine learning in general, it's a good entry point. It's a bit like Orange, hey? Like it's maybe a step more complex than Orange is. So Orange is another open source graphic user interface for doing machine learning or data analytics, and it's really nice. Like it's super streamlined and easy to get into. The learning curve is shallow. It's not quite as versatile as Nime, so that's why I was using Nime for this. And mainly I wanted to use Nime because I do want to see people using my workflows and stuff. I want to get it out there, and I think it's stuff that'll make a difference. It's not a sophisticated workflow, but maybe it's enough to get the conversation started, and more sophisticated solutions can be found down the track. But no, I think it's hopefully fairly accessible. And if anybody wants a copy, I'll email it to them or whatever. I was initially trying to publish it with the paper, and then it became really difficult to figure out how to do that. So it's, yeah.
I think you make a good point, though, about making it, maybe it's not the super sophisticated workflow that, companies really want to see. But at the same time, by having that entry level, like that's how you know that, okay, now I can see how this process works. I feel more comfortable now going out and talking with whether it's consultants or whether they're in-house data scientists and say, okay, this is in general what I want to do. I understand it. Let's talk to each other towards getting a solution that's fit for purpose for my project. So, all right, very cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to thank you all for listening to Geochemistry, and a big thanks to McLean Trott for stopping by the show, dishing some great tea twice, and taking us on this journey. Thanks to our sponsor, LKA Consulting, and to It's Water and Coma Media for our music. And if you want to learn more about the show, submit a request to be on the show, or recommend a geochemist to chase up, please go to our website at geochemistry.com and send us a message on our contact page. I'm looking forward to chatting with you all next month. And again, thanks for stopping by the show, and thanks, Mac, for hanging out with us.
Thanks for having me. Very fun.